you know pigs are really intelligent? I found that out recently and it made me feel like the worst person ever. Go, Piggy! Go! Yeah! Look at this one!
So PewDiePie seems like a multifaceted person. I guess we all are. But in recent years, he has moved in a more vegan direction.
Are they always this wobbly?
They're tofu.
Don't tell them! It's not soy, it's pure protein.
I gotta say, vegan nuggets taste exactly the same as normal nuggets.
PewDiePie definitely doesn't want to come across as a pushy and self-righteous activist like myself, but he has at times spoken about how bad the meat industry is.
If everyone was vegan and vegetarian and then they saw how animals were treated, then for sure people would be like, I can't believe they're doing this. This is awful. And considering how often people get called out on it online, it's weird how that does never, it doesn't get any traction. Listen, all I'm saying is there's a weird gap right now with people on the internet getting very upset about how animals are mistreated and ignoring a lot of shit that's happening in in the reality of the meat industry. That's all I'm saying.
I think it's great when people talk about how bad the meat industry is, even if those people aren't vegan. And PewDiePie mentions here that he isn't vegan. But if he's not vegan, what is he? An asshole? Am I right? Well, let's hear his own explanation.
What is that? Is that like a bacon and ketchup sandwich?
That looks good. I'll eat that. I don't eat meat, but it looks good.
Wait, you don't eat meat?
Yeah, you see, Ken, I am what's called a pescatarian. It's for many reasons, but I just care about the environment and the souls of the animals. And that does not necessarily put me in a better bracket or above anyone else. But I just feel bad I just have a lot of morals. And I just care more than other people. And I can tell here that Markiplier clearly does not care about other people as much as I do. Eat what you want, obviously, but I feel like we're so detached from our food. We made the process so easy for us. That's why my philosophy is that I'll eat what I would kill. Because killing things is uncomfortable. Most people wouldn't. And at least there's a level of respect there. Instead of completely distancing yourself from what goes through to these animals, which isn't fair a lot of the times.
So at the moment, PewDiePie restricts himself to eating meat from fish, but not eating meat from other animals. And he summarizes his principle as, I'll eat what I would kill. I think Hannibal Lecter also follows that principle. But still, I think PewDiePie makes a good point. If we would think of an act as bad if we did it ourselves, we should keep in mind that to the victim, it doesn't make a difference if we do it with our own hands or if we cause the exact same thing to happen in a more indirect way. I'm very glad to see that PewDiePie, one of the largest creators on YouTube, has started to care more about animals, and he's aligning his actions with those beliefs. Now, many people have seen Seaspiracy, which discusses in length the sustainability issues with fishing, but there's another side to the story that needs to be talked about more. So if you're watching this, PewDiePie, I hope you continue watching. You at least seem to think that we should make informed decisions, and this video will help with exactly that. In studies of fish, we see examples of fish recognizing people after months or even years. We see examples of tool use, we see examples of fish learning from other fish, and we see examples of play-like social behaviour. We've also seen fish learn the behavioural tendencies of other fish, and as well as keeping track of things other fish know about themselves, male fish might know that they have lower odds of hooking up with a female if she's seen him lose a fight. But beyond the rich social lives that so many fish demonstrate, the even more ethically relevant consideration is the overwhelming evidence that fish have the capacity to feel pain. For one example, here's a clip from a great documentary about fish.
In 2011, for example, Lynn Snedden wrote this paper, where she describes an experiment that, to me at least, seems to be the most convincing when it comes to demonstrating pain in fish. She confined a group of zebrafish in this contraption she called a maze. On one end of the maze was a tank enriched with gravel, plants, and a window to a neighboring tank with other zebrafish, a minimal fish playground. And on the other end of the maze was a completely barren tank. With this setup, she did 3 tests. In the first test, she simply placed the zebrafish in the maze and observed their behavior. They all went to the playground. In the second test, she divided the fish into 2 groups, injected half of them with acetic acid, which was meant to hurt them, and the other half with saline, which was meant to be harmless. She placed them back in the maze and observed their behavior. Again, they all found their way to the playground. And in the third test, she recreated the same exact circumstances as in the second test, but with one crucial difference. This time, before placing the fish back in the maze, she diluted a painkiller in the barren tank. She placed the zebrafish back in the maze, sat back, and observed. This time, the ones who had been injected with acid found their way to the barren tank. This experiment shows that these zebrafish were willing to pay a price for being in the playground to experience the effects of the painkiller, a choice that surely would only make sense if they were actually suffering.
To learn about how most wild-caught fish die, I spoke to Professor Cullen Brown, an expert in fish behaviour and cognition.
They're most often captured by some kind of seine net. And a seine net is effectively a huge net that's dragged behind a boat. And it can vary. It can vary in size. Sometimes it's dragged behind two boats that are separated from one another. So the nets can be massive. Basically what's happening to a fish in that time. First, it tries to maintain its speed and keep in front of the net. Eventually, it tries to turn around and escape, or it's exhausted and falls back into the net. Once it gets into the net, it can be crushed by the other fishes as it's being drawn along. Eventually, the nets are drawn to the surface. Now, depending on how deep they are, on the way up, the fish suffer from barotrauma, which basically means anybody who's tried to dive down and your ears start to hurt when you're snorkeling, it's the opposite. As you're coming up, the gas inside your body expands, and it expands rapidly. The higher you go, the faster that happens. And so it's a terrible experience, because any air bubble of any description inside your body basically explodes. Most of those animals have a swim bladder of some description, and the air cannot escape from that swim bladder fast enough, and so it ruptures without doubt. Sometimes the stomach and or the swim bladder are forced out through the mouth because there's nowhere else for it to go. And so, of course, that is a really horrible experience, as you can imagine. So they get to the surface, and the horror story has really only just started, because then they're brought up into the air, and they're already being crushed underwater. Well, now they're experiencing gravity and the weight, not only of themselves, but all the other fish in the net. And then, of course, they're dumped onto the deck of a boat where they're sorted. Many of them are gaffed in the process, so they're literally hooked as part of the sorting process. And a good number of them will suffocate, if they're not already dead, on the surface on the deck of the boat. To make matters worse, as if it could get any worse, most of those fishes, after being through that trauma, are actually put on ice. And for most fishes, ice just slows down the metabolic rate. It doesn't kill them. So in fact, what you're doing is prolonging the suffering, and a fish might stay alive for 2-3 hours on ice before it eventually dies, and it dies from suffocation ultimately. So the entire experience is, from any stretch of the imagination, is a horror show from start to finish.
But not all wild-caught fish die from trawlers. One method is to use gill nets. A gill net is a wall of netting that hangs in the sea, invisible to fish. When fish are too large to swim through the mesh of the net, they become trapped by their gills as they try to reverse out. Fish are left stuck with the nets in their gills for hours and sometimes days. Another method is long lining, the practice of deploying long fishing lines with hundreds or thousands of baited hooks, which are also retrieved hours or days after being placed. These methods seem to be the moral equivalent of using foot traps for foxes and leaving them there for days before slaughter, which I think we all agree is a despicable thing to do. Well, I hate to state the obvious, but doing the same thing underwater isn't any better. And on top of all of that, it's common to use live baited hooks, which means that small fish are literally impaled on a hook so that their writhing will attract other fish. The fish used as bait can be transported in really bad conditions, and I would imagine they are terrified when they're being attacked by other fish. One counter-argument to the abolition of fishing is that fish might die in terrible ways even when they're not being fished, like from being eaten alive. Brian Tomasic has an article on this which illustrates how it makes things a little bit more complicated, but while he acknowledges a level of uncertainty, he still recommends against eating fish if you want to reduce suffering. PewDiePie, you talked about only eating what you would kill, but as we've seen, this isn't only a question of killing, it's also a question of suffering. Would you crush a fish to death? Would you pull their internal organs out through their mouth? Would you take a fish out of water and watch as they took several hours to die of suffocation? Would you put them on ice while they're still alive? When it comes to land animals, the regulations to protect their well-being are way too lenient, allowing for various kinds of torture. And even the regulations that we do have are often broken. But when it comes to fishing, there are no meaningful and enforced regulations for fish welfare. Their well-being is currently given zero consideration in virtually all cases. There is some variance, of course. How fish die seems to depend on the type of fishing ship, and some ships might, say, cut their heads off before they're put on ice. And there are like 2 ships on the planet, apparently, that use electrical stunning before slaughter. But for the vast majority of fish who haven't already died from exhaustion or the change in water or air pressure or from being crushed, if they are still alive by the time they arrive on ship, they're simply left to suffocate or will die from being processed further, for example by being live gutted. This lack of concern, combined with the massive scale at which fish are fished, make for a moral atrocity that is hard to fully fathom. We're talking about roughly 1 to 3 trillion wild fish dying terribly at the hands of humans. Even if we take the lower estimate in that range, we're talking about 10 times the number of humans who have ever lived. And we're killing that many every year. We're talking about killing 32,000 wild fish per second. It is just incomprehensible. And let's not forget that fish aren't the only sea-dwelling animals we kill. The numbers become even more impossibly difficult to fathom when we include the enormous number of other small sea creatures like shrimp, who are commonly killed by being boiled alive. The number of shellfish we're killing is even larger than the number of fish we're killing, and no regard is given to their well-being either. People will sit down to a shrimp salad blissfully indifferent to the fact that every single shrimp in that salad was an individual who experienced being boiled alive. The number of sea animals we kill is without doubt impossible to fully appreciate, and the ways in which we kill them sounds like something you would read about in a book about the Middle Ages. It is totally barbaric. Now, not all the fish humans eat are wild caught, so here's a segment on fish farming from that documentary.
In recent years, fish farming has positioned itself as a more sustainable alternative to commercial fishing and has quickly risen in popularity. In 2018, 83 million tons of fish, or about 46% of that 179 million tons total, were farmed. And as to what that looks like, fish can be farmed in tanks, ponds, or pens. They're generally treated like inanimate objects, and like land animals in a land factory farm, they're always packed tightly together. This makes fish farms hotspots for diseases and parasites, and many fish die before reaching slaughter weight. In 2020, for example, Essere Animali and We Animals investigated fish farms across Greece, Europe's largest fish supplier, and according to the owners of the farms they investigated, up to 1 in 5 fish die before slaughter. And when it comes time for them to be slaughtered, they generally die by being crushed under each other's weight in nets or containers, being dumped in a mixture of ice and water that clogs their gills and freezes them to death, or having their gills cut. Oh yeah, and also they're suffocating through all of that. And because of the sheer volume of fish these industries kill, many inevitably slip through the cracks and keep suffering long after they should have been resting in peace. In 2018, Compassion in World Farming investigated fish farms across Europe, documented fish being frozen alive, and on multiple occasions, investigators witnessed fish displaying clear signs of consciousness over an hour after being put on ice.
And as if all of that wasn't bad enough, farmed fish tend to be fed with wild-caught fish, which means fish farms are also contributing to the horror show that was described earlier. PewDiePie says he still eats fish because he's okay with eating animals that he would be willing to kill himself. But here's a question for you. Why is it that people feel so much more comfortable with killing a fish compared with killing a chicken or a cow? It seems to me that the reason someone is more likely to be willing to kill a fish compared to another animal isn't because they lack a capacity to suffer. They do suffer. They suffer a lot. I think it's partly because we can't see their suffering as clearly as we can in other animals. And so it bothers us less. But does the panic caused by being unable to breathe feel any less horrible because they can't look scared? Does the lack of an ability to scream make being crushed feel less bad? The way fish look and their inability to vocalize their distress makes a huge difference in how we feel about their suffering. But to them, it doesn't make a difference. These morally irrelevant differences have contributed to our blind spot when it comes to fish. When we hear someone scream in distress, it conveys a sense of urgency. It suggests that they have an urgent desire to escape something. And when that is communicated to us, it's hard to ignore, whether that someone is a human or an animal. There are countless individuals desperate to escape something unbearable right now. But they're unable to communicate the terribleness of what they're going through in a way that makes us understand. It's tempting to wonder how different things might have been, if only their inner experience could be better witnessed by apes like us. And maybe it's asking a lot for human beings, who are the result of a completely amoral and unguided process, to extend our circle of compassion to include beings who seem so very different. After all, it's not our fault that we find it so hard to take on the perspective of someone who can't smile when they're happy, or cry when they're sad. Maybe it's true that the further someone seems from being like us, the harder it becomes to ask, what if it was me? But it should come as no surprise that, despite our differences, we do have some things in common. Like us, they are experiencing something. And just like our experience matters to us, their experience matters to them. Look, I think we should give PewDiePie credit for reducing his meat consumption and for raising awareness about issues with the meat industry. This isn't a call-out video. But even so, I think that when we consider the extreme suffering that fish are going through, it's clear. They need our consideration and protection just as much as cows, chickens, cats, and dogs do. And PewDiePie would be able to have an incredible impact for fish if he were to raise awareness about what's happening to them to his millions of fans. But if you're not a famous YouTuber and still want to help, you can. You can also boycott fish products like I do. You can take part in advocacy campaigns organised by non-profits like the Humane League, and you can donate to Fish Welfare Initiative, who are working to help farmed fish. For instance, one cause of suffering for farmed fish is the poor water quality, which I didn't really consider before reading about it, but it makes sense because fish are in constant contact with the water. So poor water quality affects fish similarly to how a less hospitable atmosphere would affect humans. Kinda like how I feel when I use the toilet after my flatmate. My eyes! Anyway, if you're not ready to commit to changing your diet or donating, an easy way to help is to raise awareness of the plight of fish by sharing this video If you're interested in learning more about fish, I would really recommend the documentary How Conscious Can a Fish Be?, which you'll find pinned in the comment section of this video. This video is part of a series about what is happening to animals. The first video in this series was about pigs. If you want to see future episodes, then be sure to hit the bell icon. With that said, a special thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel and making this possible. I'll see you very soon with another video.